This episode of The Biggest Table is brought to you in part by Wild Goose Coffee. Since 2008, Wild Goose has sought to build better communities through coffee. For our listeners, Wild Goose is offering a special promotion of 20% off a one-time order using the code TABLE at checkout. To learn more and to order coffee, please visit wildgoosecoffee.com. I hope you enjoy my conversation with Paul and Billie Hoard. Hello, and welcome to another episode of The Biggest Table. I am your host, Andrew Camp. In this podcast, we explore the table, food, eating, and hospitality as an arena for experiencing God's love and our love for one another. And today, I'm joined by siblings Paul and Billie Hoard. Paul is a licensed counselor, psychoanalytic psychotherapist, and associate professor of counseling psychology at the Seattle School of Theology and Psychology. His scholarship focuses on Lacanian psychoanalytic theory, sexuality, white body supremacy, perpetration-induced traumatic stress, and the theological logic of disgust. He has spoken and published internationally on topics including purity culture, trauma, contamination, and the intersections of theology and psychoanalysis. Billie is a trans woman, teacher, writer, and something of an Anabaptist radical. Together with her brother Paul, they co-authored the book Contamination. Billie holds an MA in liberal arts from St. John's College, and she writes about queerness, fairy tales, C.S. Lewis, theology, and philosophy. So thanks for joining me today. Really enjoyed your book. We first met at Theology Beer Camp. I guess that was back in 24 in Denver when you guys did the the pregame conference on contamination.
That whole meal and entire experience thing. It was fun.
It was one of those moments where I was like, oh, this is what I've been looking for and wanting to experience, and like made me realize, okay, these are my people. We need to talk more. And so yeah, it's been fun to read your book and to stay in touch.
Mm-hmm.
So we're just going to start here. Not many people write about disgust or think about disgust. And so what made you want to be interested in writing a theological discourse on disgust?
So I'll jump in, Billie,
Okay.
if that's all right. I think
Do it.
We mentioned just before you hit recording Richard Beck's book Unclean. So both of us had read that one, had read his book, and it got the wheels turning in my head quite a bit as a as a mental health professional, professor of counseling psychology. It's obviously right in kind of my wheelhouse in many of those ways, but also I think some of it also was from my own professional background. I cut my teeth as a therapist working with individuals who had been adjudicated for various offenses, some of them sexual offenses. And so I'd already spent a lot with people that had been labeled disgusting, that had done things that are horrific, that are monstrous, and sort of the lens of disgust had already been something that was already kind of in my professional mind. I'd done some work around inappropriate or maladaptive, sometimes it gets called, if not aggressive or abusive, kind of full spectrum there of different types of sexual behavior. And that obviously borders on disgust, and there's a lot of overlap there. So I was sort of primed for it professionally as a therapist in that sense when I ran across Beck's work. And then it was really the combination of Beck and Haidt's work that Haidt's in particular, his earlier stuff on like moral foundations theory. I think it's The Righteous Mind was his popular book on that.
Yeah.
That got Billie and I really talking about it. And part of what was helpful is that we started getting interested, and then it started being really useful. Like it just became a really helpful way to understand or begin to make sense of what was happening in our world, what was happening in ourselves, happening with my patients. And so we kind of kept digging further into it. And I remember it was sort of, like many therapists, I loved the movie Inside Out, the first one when it came out. I think it's one of the requirements to get your license these days, I think. And disgust was one of those little characters. It's probably the most surprising one that's there. Like anxiety makes sense, joy makes sense, or anxiety wasn't in the first one, but sadness makes sense, fear, and all that. But disgust is sort of like, that's interesting that would be one of these core emotions. We wrestle with disgust, but the more we dove into the literature and the research on disgust, and the more I was getting into kind of researching psychoanalytic theory and getting trained as an analytic therapist, the more central I realized disgust is to the formation of the self, both individually, but then also corporately as we think of like the us. And that just became this really helpful lens to begin looking into things. Billie, anything else you'd want to add there?
I mean, so again, I was having the same, I mean, Paul and I were having these conversations back and forth. I mean, this all sort of started with just, we would read things and then recommend them to each other and then have these, I had an hour-long commute back then. So we would have these like hour-long conversations a couple times a week. So just hashing out stuff and like Paul, Disgust seemed, it caught me as something that was underexplored and then was surprisingly effective as a framework for understanding what I was seeing around me, right? And for me, I was not yet, when all this started, I was not yet out. I think my egg might have cracked. So I might have realized I was trans, but I was not out as queer at all. But I was in the kind of space of queer advocacy in the church and trying to, and the degree to which Disgust as a framework made sense of the behavior and rhetoric I was seeing from non-affirming people towards queer people as Christians was really, really helpful, right? It made behaviors make sense that otherwise I couldn't find an explanation for. We have questions around like, well, why do Christians treat queerness so differently from other things that they believe to be sins? Are you bracketing the whole question of the sinfulness of homosexuality or whatever? Even if I were to grant it, why do they treat it so differently, right? It becomes this really big question. And Disgust made sense. Disgust makes their behavior make sense. So I think both Paul and I found Disgust to be compelling, both as just this, as an underexplored topic and framework, but also as an almost overly, like surprisingly overly effective framework for analyzing and understanding what was happening. So not well enough explored and really far more useful than people seem to give it credit for being.
Super helpful. And so then what is Disgust? Like, help us name, like, okay, what are we actually talking about? Because we all have an idea of it, but we don't probably have words to fully explain it.
Yeah. And I think that's part of it, right? We talk a lot about fear. We'll talk a lot about anger. Those are pretty common emotions to talk about. But then disgust is sort of like, well, it's just gross. Something gross. It's just, I don't know, it's disgusting. And that just sort of ends a conversation typically. So when you dive into it, one, just kind of trigger warning to your listeners who may be here for something about food.
Yeah.
We are going to talk about disgust. Those two overlap. So if you are eating, maybe put the food down for a second while we talk about this. Because
we'll bring it back, I promise.
Disgust is directly tied to eating, right? In fact, even the facial expression of disgust is that of vomiting or being about to, because disgust is about the emotion that helps you delineate what's able to be taken in to be a part of me, to become me. If you think about food, becomes us. What's going to be metabolism, and what is poison? What needs to be expelled? What needs to be spat out, eliminated, gone? And so help differentiate between. So it's the emotion that it's a protective emotion, and it's really, really important. So some theorists speculated, we evolved disgust to deal with what's called the omnivore's dilemma. Humans can eat almost anything, but some things will kill us. So we developed disgust to avoid that. Others look at it more from a developmental standpoint, that actually babies aren't born with disgust. They'll kind of do the finger paint with their feces as opposed to being grossed out. And it's adults that have to help them be like, ooh, no, gross. That's yucky. We don't touch that. That's yucky, right? Whereas they want to put everything in their mouths. We have to teach them what is gross. So disgust becomes this. Oh, go ahead.
I'm jumping, Paula. Even the sound we make when we're teaching them, I've been thinking about this, right? As we say, we sort of mime or hint towards nausea or vomiting as that is the proper response to this substance that I don't want you to be touching right now, child.
But it's this really ambiguous, and I think it's very contextual, right? Because the very idea that you can have a phrase these days like "don't yuck my yum" indicates that there's something that I'm going to find yummy that you're going to find yucky, right? Which means it's less about the inherent thing and more about my relationship to the thing. So there's a couple of examples that I think are helpful here. One being, like, there's a great Jerry Seinfeld stand-up on hair, right? How hair on somebody's head is kind of beautiful and we're often attractive and we enjoy it. But as soon as the hair leaves their head, ew, get it off me, right? Because suddenly it's ambiguous. Is the hair still them? Or is it not that? Has it become something other? Whereas when it's attached, it still feels like, oh, this is me. This is part of me. You quit pulling on me, I might say, if you're pulling my hair. Whereas if you're just holding my hair that fell off, it's just a hair. But disgust is what helps us create this clarity in the face of ambiguity, and doesn't necessarily follow logical lines, right? In another clear example that's often used in the literature, just sort of like this thought experiment of if I had a perfectly sterile cup and asked you to spit in it, very few people would be open to drinking their own saliva, even though every time you drink anything or eat anything, you are consuming your own saliva, right? Nothing magical happens to it when it leaves your mouth in its essence, but everything happens to it in your relationship to it. It is no longer you, it's other. And so it can't be taken back in. And disgust is what helps delineate that. And so a couple things that are important to keep in mind about disgust is that it's very embodied. We feel disgust connected to our mouths. It's very much a part of our physical selves. And so I think all emotions actually are, but in the US, we have a tendency to separate emotions from our minds and act as if those are all disconnected when we are quite integrated. And so disgust is a helpful reminder that, like, we are very integrated. Who we are, what we take in. This is very much about who psyche thinks we are, who we imagine ourselves to be. Those are all deeply connected. And so disgust is this really fascinating emotion that protects us, but then also can be often over-applied so that it becomes difficult for us to interact in a nuanced and complex way with something that we experience as other. Yeah. And so this is where, like, again, on a very simple level, if you have toddlers at home, you have run into this. Like, please eat your broccoli. No, that's yucky. As soon as the broccoli is disgusting, there's no arguing with that. It just is. And every parent's going to deal with that how they will. But the fact that, ooh, it's yucky isn't an invitation to, like, well, let's talk about the yucky elements and what might discuss this and let's make a little argument. No. This is an ontological statement about the broccoli, and that, or actually what it is a statement of my relationship with broccoli, and that I do not want that to become part of me anymore. I'm going to refuse that. And this is one of those things that I think is really important. As soon as disgust is present, we've created a binary of what can and can't become me. And disgust also is this fascinating way that the technical term is dose insensitivity, that it doesn't matter how much of the bad thing. Like, it's not just that I don't want to eat the broccoli. It's I don't want the broccoli to be anywhere near my macaroni and cheese. Like, I don't even want them to, like, think about each other. Like, there needs to be, like, a gap in the bowl. I'm thinking about my toddlers, my young ones here. They can't be. They touched each other. It's infected.
And we literally make those plates for them that have the dividers on the plates to take care of this problem.
Yep.
But we do that in our lives as well, right? Yeah. And so it's if I, again, going back to, like, thinking about hair, if my hair got into somebody else's drink, you wouldn't say, well, how much hair got in there? You just go get yourself a new drink, right? Or if somebody sneezed, you don't really check, well, only a little bit of sneeze got in my water. It's any amount of sneezing. Mm-hmm. And that's when we know disgust is prevalent, because fear is another one. And I just realized I'm talking about it, so Billie, take over in a second. But fear is very similar to disgust in that it protects us. But fear can be mitigated somewhat with what was called, like, a harm reduction approach. So, like, it's dangerous and kind of scary to drive a car. Many of us have learned to cope with that. We put on seatbelts, we follow rules, we operate our vehicles in very particular ways to minimize the safety, but there's an inherent risk there. We're not disgusted by it, so we're willing to tolerate that risk. Whereas if somebody sneezes on your water, there is a risk that you will get ill. It's actually probably pretty low, honestly. But most of us, like, it doesn't matter because it's not fear, it's disgust at play. So any thought of the sneeze getting in my water is enough to make me go get a new water. Mm-hmm. And so you see that difference where there's that, like, it's this binary operation as opposed to a harm reduction. So what do you pick up from here? Or what do you want to add to that?
All the directions I would go would be theological at this point, or social. So I'm going to hold off and wait for the next question.
Why don't you go sociological, actually? Why don't you go more social? I focused on the individual there. You take it.
Yeah, no, that's probably worthwhile. Okay, so one of the, like, sort of fascinating things, and I did jump in with the sociologist. Again, my interest came from sort of that sphere, is that this affect translates up, if you will, or transposes up from the biological, what we eat, what we consume when we think of, just substances, to the social very, very easily. right? And a lot of this has to do with the way that we identify as members of groups, right? So, in the church, we use the phrase "the corporate body." We talk about the body of Christ. We are, the corporate, structure that is the church, the body that is this group, right? And if we are a body, then people coming into that body become themselves potential contaminants, right? They become potential sources of disgust. And this is where what can, at a biological level, be a problem. Again, if it's over applied, if it becomes overdeveloped, and you get somebody who becomes such a picky eater that they can't eat anything. And I know that there are whole issues that can develop around that.
Like OCD, for example.
Absolutely. But when that translates up to the social, this means people that can't tolerate even being in the presence or having other persons be members of their body, be members of their social, corporate, collective body. And a lot of the mechanisms that we use at the biological level to react to things we find disgusting also transpose up to the social level and have their own sort of transposed iterations, right? So the kind of violent ejection of people, the really sort of overly energetic quarantining off of certain types of people or of ideas, right? It transposes in other directions as well. It transposes into the intellectual sphere. It transposes in the religious sphere, and we can probably talk about that some too. So there are all these ways where all of a sudden this, again, overdeveloped, overexposed disgust reaction or disgust mentality, if you will, can become a real problem. And that was sort of, we started with that knot, right? So we kept going back down and back up, down and back up to the down to the biological, back up to the social, down to the biological. We see a lot of this acting at the political level these days. And we think that, again, disgust has a lot of explanatory power for what we're seeing.
I love that you brought it to the sociological level because, like Paul, you mentioned, disgust helps literally save our lives, in a food-related way. And disgust is very food-related. My wife's reaction to oysters is one of disgust, whereas I'm like, give me more oysters, like give them to me, right? Like to her, they're snot. To me, they're just these perfect, delightful delicacies of salinity and umami. And when you drink it with champagne, it's beautiful, right? But like for her, she just can't get past it. But it's at the sociological level where we see disgust that begins to harm, right? And that's where the ostracization of people begins to make sense. And this then ties into the biblical idea of then like purity and holiness. Like we got to maintain our collective identity and be pure. And then disgust comes into play with that. So like how extrapolate that for us so we can understand how this actually impacts my walk with Jesus. Because that's hopefully ultimately what we want to help people unpack a little.
Well, I'll start with this, Billy, and then I'll let you land it.
Yeah, because I'm going to run, but you say your thing first.
I know. I can see you all geared for this. I'll just start with disgust. It's culturally, say at least in the U.S., and we can make a broad statement, and of course it's a generalization, so keep all the caveats with that. But generally, disgust is not something we're okay with. We generally would feel ashamed of being like acknowledging that we're disgusted by somebody. What that means is we rarely tell that conscious story to ourselves. So I'm guessing most of the listeners don't walk around thinking, oh yeah, that person disgusts me, and that person disgusts me, and that group disgusts me. Instead, we often tell ourselves stories like they're a threat, they're dangerous, they're bad, they're predators, whatever. We use these other terms to kind of code it, to hide the disgust from ourselves. And so the first thing is to notice actually that we are disgusted. And that's why I kind of spent so much time talking about the logic of how disgust works, because you're rarely going to see it explicitly unless you're looking for it. What you're going to notice is that, the way I react is as if I'm disgusted by them. And so that's where like disgust is going to happen prior to the story you're telling yourself. So in the US, we tend to think that we're thoughts first, and then once we've understood the world, then we have emotional reactions based on our understanding of the world. But actually, we have an emotional reaction, and then we tell ourselves a story to make sense of it. So if I'm disgusted by you, Andrew, let's say, I will first feel that disgust, and then I'll tell myself the story that makes sense of that disgust. Well, obviously Andrew has glasses and a big microphone, so obviously he's a terrible human being that's just going to ruin our children, right? I'm going to first feel that, but then I'm going to rationalize that. The reason this matters is that if somebody tries to talk to me about my rationalization, you could show that doesn't make sense, and I'll just come up with a new one. It doesn't change. It won't help me better understand myself. It'll just get us both frustrated because we're not dealing with what's actually causing it, which is that there's something disgusting, man. My affect is being triggered in a certain way that like I feel a threat, and then I'm going to make sense of it later. What we need to be able to do is slow down to notice the emotional reaction that's happening in order to be able to have differences. And so this matters about theology and Jesus is because often we tell ourselves sin is a threat, or that like I'm just trying to do what God tells me to do. We have all these stories, but oftentimes we're actually just reacting out of our own disgust. And what we're protecting is our own ego, is our own sense of self, is the image of who we are, which another word for that, and we can argue about this later, would be an idol. Would be this idol of ourselves and of the world we want, as opposed to dealing with the reality of, we're actually disgusted by each other, and God's command, Jesus' command for us to love, requires that we confront our own disgust in order to be able to move past it, to see the humanity and the dignity and the image of Christ in the other, without pretending that there also may not be threat and risk in their wisdom. And that's why I love that phrase, let's be wise as serpents and innocent as doves, because I think that's sort of what this discussion around disgust can help us see with theology. But I'll let Billie connect those dots better, because I think I'm veering off in another direction. So Billie,
you're good. Go ahead.
I'd love to hear your thoughts, Billie. And I'm curious, like, I'm just going to make this real for my listeners. Like, there might be some of my listeners who, when Billie was introduced, might have had a reaction. Like, you know, and to like, hopefully they didn't turn it off, and hopefully you're, as a listener, are engaging. But to recognize, like, did you have a reaction when I introduced Billie as a trans woman? Like, like, let's just own, like, be honest with what may or may not be happening with the listeners who come from every walk of life.
Absolutely.
And so, like, I think that's just even important to name as we're talking about this in a theological, Jesus-centered way.
No, I think it's absolutely relevant and true. And I would encourage people to sit with it. Right. Again, I think a common reaction people sometimes will have is to say, well, no, I wasn't disgusted. And I think Paul's right in saying that we are far more frequently disgusted by other people than we care to admit. We reserve that designation of disgusting for severe moral approbation, right? So when I'm reaching for a way to express to the world that I am profoundly troubled and utterly reject somebody's moral behavior, somebody on moral grounds, at that point, I might say I am disgusted by them, right? And which is probably true at that point, by the way. Like I'm not suggesting that at that point we're not disgusted. I'm suggesting that because we use it in that way, we've sort of elevated it to this like extreme rejection because of the way disgust works, because of the implications of a person being labeled or categorized as disgusting, that we then do not recognize how frequently we actually are disgusted far earlier than when we reach the stage when we're willing to actually say and name that out loud. So if we bring all this together and I want to get to the theological point on it, right? So disgust has this docent sensitivity. It has it's this binary logic that says you can have it in. If it's there, you're contaminated. Period. That's end of story. If it's not there, you're pure. There's no gray area. There's no space in between. And what that does, among other things, is it places all the power in the contaminant, right? So the contaminant is the term we would use for the thing that is the object of our disgust, the thing that threatens to contaminate us and therefore we experience as disgusting. Whether we accurately or inaccurately identify that thing as potentially contaminating us, it becomes the contaminant, right? So we're going to treat it that way. And what that does, though, is it puts all of the power into the hands of the contaminant. Because to use the sort of the classic example, if I have a bucket of pure water and I ask you to drink it out of, a large cup of pure water, I ask you to drink out of it, you're going to be happy to do that. If I introduce just the smallest amount, Paul used to sneeze, if I sneeze into your cup, not a lot of material has entered your cup, and yet you're not willing to do it, right? But if I take a cup full of my sneeze product and I introduce just a thimble full of pure water to it, you're still not going to be willing to drink out of it, right? So what that tells us is that the power is all with the contaminant. What we identify as pure, we also identify as fragile, as weak. What we identify as disgusting, we also identify as powerful, right? There are a lot of really troubling political implications to this that I'm going to leave alone for half a minute, and maybe we can come back later if we want to. But at a religious level, this creates a theological problem that I think needs to be called out, right? This is one of the things I'm most excited about theologically about our work, because the implication of this, and it's an implication that I think no Orthodox Christian would ever, most or unorthodox Christians would not want to acknowledge. The implication would be then that sin is more powerful than holiness. We associate holiness, we associate the church, we associate God with purity. But what is pure is fragile in our, in the sort of basic logic of disgust. What is pure has to be fragile. What is contaminating is powerful. But we would, in the same breath, need to deny, if we're going to stay anywhere near the realm of orthodoxy, that sin is more powerful than goodness, that sin is more powerful than holiness or love or purity. So what do we do with that? Well, enter Jesus.
Yes.
I love bringing Jesus into the conversation, right? Jesus comes in, and when I'm going to go narrative here for a second and say that when Paul and I first started talking about all of this, we kind of had this idea, and I think it is probably a natural first idea, that Jesus just sort of abolishes disgust logic. Jesus says, no, that's all wrong, at least as applies to people. Like, that's just not correct. Right? Because, and Jesus certainly does act as though he is not threatened by being contaminated by sin. He is not threatened by that which the world around him sees, treats, identifies as morally or physically disgusting, right? He's touching people who are thought to have communicable skin diseases. He is eating with people with whom, at a religious level, eating with those people is supposed to contaminate him. Also at a religious level, he's doing all these things, and he's acting as though he can't be contaminated. And so our first pass sort of assumption was that Jesus sort of says no and abolishes disgust logic. But as we pushed harder, we found that actually the opposite is true. Jesus, well, sort of. Jesus does not abolish disgust logic. He actually inverts it, right? So instead of saying, they're kind of equally, purity and contamination are equally powerful, or just disgust logic doesn't work, he actually sort of affirms disgust logic. But he resituates the good and love into the place of the contaminant, into the place of the powerful thing, which, when introduced in any quantity to the wrong, broken, sinful body, begins a process of good transformation, right? This is where...
This
go ahead,
is
Paul.
salt and light, yeast. These metaphors of like just a little bit of this works its way through, right? The little bit of yeast in the whole dough. Sorry, just interrupted you there.
Well, no, and this is what's really exciting, is that once we saw that Jesus is actually inverting the logic of disgust rather than abolishing it, right? You start to see that actually this is also operant in the physical world. Jesus had actual examples to draw on, and Paul's talked about salt and light and yeast, right? That there are substances which, when introduced, bring about good change, right? In almost any, introduced in almost any quantity. A little yeast works its way through the whole dough, as really any baker can tell you. I give it the time and give it some sugar, it's going to work its way through the whole dough. It's going to work its way through all the beer. You're going to have really good things happen over time.
Mm-hmm. But what's interesting too is, like, at the same time, and again, I think this is going to nuance, and Jesus uses leaven as an example of the Pharisees, like a little leaven from the Pharisees, you can corrupt too. Like, so it's a weird, like, it's not as, again, black and white always, as we want it to be. But I think you're right, Billy, in saying, like, Jesus becomes this good contaminant. And lest our listeners think, well, I never bought into this idea. As, like, think back to youth group. Like, you and I think we were all raised in this evangelical subculture of youth groups where, like, hey, be careful. if you get in with the wrong crowd, they're going to impact, you're not going to impact them. They're going to impact you, like, and that's what it was always about. Like the wrong person is going to impact you. Their sin or their whatever they are is going to be more powerful than who Jesus is in me. It was always the story in youth group.
No, it was. And it looking back on it now, right, as a 43-year-old woman, it really has me wondering, like, what happened? How did I handle, I don't even remember experiencing as cognitive dissonance the fact that I would hear that one Sunday, and the next Sunday I would be reminded, greater is he that is in you than he that is in the world. Do not be afraid, I have overcome the world. Right? How do I hold those? I didn't have a way of holding those two things together other than just not looking at both of them at the same time.
Right. Well, and we were 16 and didn't have prefrontal cortexes. Like, come on, like there were very few things I was thinking about in high school of how to hold these two in, conjunction. I was thinking about girls. Like, let's be honest, of what our minds were thinking about in youth group. Like, so, I don't think, the church obviously didn't give us space to hold these nuances. But again, I don't think my 16-year-old brain was capable also.
Yeah. I think one of the danger needs to be remembered, right? Like there is significant danger and there is significant harm that is caused by a failure to examine the role that disgust is playing, right?
Yep.
When we, and I think one of the things that really stands out to me more and more as we sit with this, we researched and then we talked and we wrote this book and we drafted it and then we redrafted it, is the degree to which I talked about transposing from the biological up to the sociological and over to the religious and political and all the rest of that. It's that these things are constantly pinging around within us. Like at a psychological level, I don't think we're making this distinction a whole lot. We are experiencing disgust. We experience disgust in particular ways. Like Paul said, it's just this very physical, embodied affect. All affects really are physical, are embodied, right? But it's just the thing that's happening. And so then we just grab onto whatever mechanisms we have developed for responding to disgust. It's get it out, get it out, get it out, get it off, get it off, get it off, kill it with fire. And I'm going to go ahead. I'm going to go here. I'm sorry if we're going to go controversial I don't know. I even feel bad now saying that, but I'm going that way. I think we're seeing, I want to drive home how dangerous, how bad, how harmful this can be. We're recording this on January 12th. Right, this is less than a week after a woman was shot by ICE officers. Mm-hmm. And as I have been watching the way that the nation has been responding to that over the course of this last week, I feel like a particular political cartoon I once saw, where it's a sort of old college professor looking fellow sitting in a chair saying, those who don't study history are doomed to repeat it. Those who do study history are doomed to sit by and watch while others repeat it. And I feel a bit like that as a scholar of disgust right now. Because what we have watched is these videos of this woman being shot by an agent of the state. And then we have seen, as people who want to vindicate that action work to inculcate disgust towards that woman. Her queerness is being emphasized. Her leftism is being emphasized. They are floating rumors and suggestions that she was, whether they're accurate or not, and honestly, I don't know, that she was actively part of one of these anti-ICE watch groups. In fact, I found out today that yesterday the president was arguing that, well, she was being very rude to this officer, that she was being very, very, very inappropriate. In the sense of like she was harassing him and saying nasty, mean things, and people shouldn't. And if we pause for half a second and put on this disgust analysis framework, right? What's happening, I would argue, is that these officials have understood at a kind of basic level that if they can get the public to feel disgust towards her and who she is, to identify her as a potential contaminant to society, then they will not grieve her loss. Her death, whether it was done in a way that is legally appropriate, whether her murder was accomplished in a way that we would actually, in any good society, want our law enforcement officials to follow. Even if you do, I know I'm a pacifist, I don't think anybody should be shooting anybody, but even if you accept there's a context in which a law enforcement official should be shooting people, it's way outside any realm of good governance and jurisprudence, that won't matter if they can get you to feel disgust towards her.
Yep.
Because at that point, the affect of it all is get it out, get it out, get it out, kill it with fire.
Right. And then that buys into what you guys talk about in terms of the bullshit. We, again, we're just going to be controversial this episode, like my family friendly episode's no longer family friendly. So,
sorry,
it's all good. No, it's perfect, but it's important, right? Because this does like, this is real life. This is what's happening in our world. And I think what the media wants, they feed us what the bullshit we want to hear, which then helps us evade or, prevents us from looking at our disgust reactions, our, figuring out, okay, what is actually going on. And so Paul, I'd be curious, like, can you explain sort of this idea? Because while it sounds crude and crass, I think it's actually really helpful as we think about disgust.
Yeah. So we're borrowing the term bullshit from Harry Frankfurt, philosopher, who has a great little book called On Bullshit. So as an academic, we are using it in an academic way, just to be honest, that is happening. But I do think it's really helpful, because what Frankfurt does is distinguish between lies and bullshit. And so he actually argues that bullshit is a greater threat to truth than dishonesty is, than lies are. Because if I'm a liar, then I believe what is true. I know what I think the truth is. And if I'm lying to you, I'm actually trying to hide that. I'm trying to hide it from you, obfuscate it, which means I still have a commitment to it. We have a shared idea of what we think truth would be, and I'm just trying to deceive you. Whereas the bullshitter, I don't care what's true. It's this kind of malicious indifference where my focus isn't on deceiving you or not, it's on creating a particular impression in you. So the bullshitter just tries to make the other person feel a certain way. Now, the way Billie and I sort of play with this term in our book is that our egos, our conscious selves, are actually more drawn towards bullshit than we are towards truth. And this is why I think Jesus spends so much time talking about what truth is and what it's like to be on the side of truth, and how those who live in darkness kind of like the darkness and go after the darkness. Because if you're pursuing comfort, if that's your kind of primary, like, the principle is your thing, bullshit will feel good. It'll be a balm. Because truth is always going to be somewhat disturbing and pushing you to say, actually, what if your world isn't quite the way you think it is? What if there's more going on here? What if you are disgusted by that? What if you don't love your neighbor well? What if there is more happening? And that's really uncomfortable to be living that way. So the easier road, right, the path of least resistance is going to be to buy into bullshit, which is why if anybody spends more than 3 months on social media, you'll notice you're in a particular echo chamber. Like, it's literally designed to guide you into whatever flavor of bullshit fits you best, because it's the stuff you like to hear. And we can't help but be drawn towards it. What we can do is begin to start noticing our penchant for it, like how much we like it, and then to start recognizing when we're making decisions more for bullshit than for truth. Like maybe the epitome of this example is like in the Matrix, and I forget the character's name, but the one character who chooses to have his memory wiped so he can go back into the bullshit Matrix world, right? So, and
Cypher.
Cypher?
Yep.
And all of us, or at least myself and many of the people I would talk to, would typically say, I would never do that. And yet I think what psychology over and over with choice, that we would rather the pretend world that feels good over the real world that's uncomfortable. And I think that's what, like, ancient philosophy shows us. I think that's what Jesus teaches. I think that's what a lot of different wisdom traditions continue to point us to, is that we have to develop the humility to recognize our own desire for bullshit.
And that's where, like, again, you bring in Jesus as the way, the truth, and the life, and you expound on it for multiple chapters. And again, there's so much in this book that is worth unpacking. But what you talk about through and through the book is that, Jesus as a you contaminant is disturbing, and that it does disrupt, and hopefully you even write that you hope you're not just speaking to the choir and feeding into our, what I want to hear, versus how are you helping me wrestle with more and more of who I want to be, and who Jesus is calling me to be. And so that the truth is unsettling. Jesus is unsettling. And so how do we even then move past? Like we're confronted with this disgust, again, hearkening back to our youth group days, we're to love the sinner but hate the sin, which I think is psychologically impossible at certain points. But like on both sides, right? We see disgust operating, and I don't think one side is immune to it. Like I have disgust, like I'm disgusted by rhetoric. But so how do I avoid making people I disagree with animals or enemies? And how do I actually move towards love of the people that I would find hold repulsive ideas? Because that's where, like, this is where we need to get to, right? Like, how do we move past, and how do we actually love? Because when we love our enemies, like you write, we find we actually don't have enemies anymore. We actually have people, and we have our people.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I just get excited about this part. You're going to jump in. I didn't mean to cut you off there, Andrew.
Nope, you're good. I had nothing else to say.
So Billie, how about I answer this on an individual level, and then I'll invite you on the corporate kind of, because we actually tie this into the church quite directly, because I think actually Jesus gives us a lot of examples of how to do this. And there's so individually, there's a couple things I would say. The first is the humility to recognize you are disgusted. Like, so first, just slow down and notice your own reaction. When you're finding yourself getting angrier, when you're finding yourself telling yourself you're afraid, when you feel the panic, like it's really healthy to understand your bodily signals and to be more curious about your emotions, and how actually any particular state is often a cocktail of different feelings, and that it's okay to things in there. And so I think because we're taught that we shouldn't be disgusted, right? That good, particularly if your listeners are, identify as sort of religious or Christian in some way, I'm supposed to love my enemies. I'm supposed to be disgusted by them. I'm the good one. They're the ones that hate. You forget this, right? It's to first take that verse where Jesus says, take the plank out of your own eye before you take a speck out of your neighbor's, to recognize like you are disgusted. Like I am disgusted, and that like this is something we have to wrestle with. So the first is just the openness to our own. Just invite, like, slow down and take stock of your day, take stock of how you scroll the news, how you like what happens when people disagree with you online or face to face, or when somebody talks about a political party. Those are often places where things happen. Like, what does it feel like in your body? And if you can let yourself notice your disgust, it's actually really powerful, is to first notice, because if you don't notice, you can't do anything about it. The second one is to then slow down. And this is where mindfulness becomes really helpful. Like slowing down to become aware of like, okay, my body is having a reaction. And it is really important to honor what's happening and to let your body have the reaction it is. But but your body's reacting to your perception. It's not reacting to reality. And this is where when you're disgusted by something, it actually has much more to do with you as the disgusted than it does about the thing that you're finding disgusting. Right? This is why, like, the toddler hating the broccoli, it's not about the broccoli. It's about the toddler's relationship to the broccoli and often their desire for candy. It has to do more with candy than it does with broccoli, actually. And so when you notice you're disgusted, slow yourself down. Just allow yourself to be curious. That's where talking to a friend, talking to a therapist, beginning to kind of unpack that can be really helpful. But really, and this is, I'll pause here because this is where it kind of leans into what Billie's going to take us, is that the thing that actually inverts is relationship. It's intimacy. There's a lot out there about how be in proximity with others who are different than you. And I agree. I think proximity is really good, but actually proximity in relationship. And so, like, I gave you that thought experiment about saliva at the beginning of the show. If you imagine what that's like and how gross that is, and then compare that to two romantic partners kissing, right? Saliva is exchanged in both. However, one is beautiful and connective and actually is a sign of deep relationship, and the other one is ew. Right? What changes it is the relationship. Relationship completely undermines, subverts, inverts, whatever word we want to use, disgust. So intimacy and relationship, and healthy, obviously, like all the boundaries and health, like please keep all that in mind as your listeners, but healthy relationships actually invert our disgust reaction. So in a nutshell, it's notice, be humble enough to notice you're disgusted, slow down, mindfully be aware of your bodily reaction. Don't just try to be a mind that fixes yourself, but be in relationship, and then cultivate relationships with those that are difficult for you to cultivate. Obviously, safely, don't put yourself at risk, and all the caveats of like self-care, those sorts of things. Billie, take it away on a more corporate level.
No, I love it. I mean, that is, sorry, it makes me happy too, right? it doesn't have to be romantic intimacy, right? We get shy about these things. Any kind of intimacy has the impact of decreasing disgust, right? Like there's I think back to 10, 12 years ago when they were doing lots of studies about how to get people to be more accepting of LGBTQ plus people. And a lot of it was, well, if you know and are friends with someone, you are statistically far more likely to be, affirming or supportive of gay rights or what have you. Seeing people, even having a parasocial relationship with somebody, can decrease your disgust reaction towards the thing that you associate with them with, that you otherwise might even consider them to have been infected by, depending on how you think about all of that, right? So it works at all kinds of different levels. And again, friendship is a perfectly legitimate, effective one. And at the religious level, what this means is it, just not to oversell things, but it means that Christianity is packed with power on exactly this level if we would just allow it to be. If we would just allow it to be what it has the potential to become, and what we actually argue Jesus designed it to be, what Jesus designed the church to do, what Jesus, the sacraments that God gave us, that Christ gave us, are in fact all practically tailor-made to help us gain greater control over our disgust reaction so that it can be directed in a way that is both healthy. Again, I do need to keep from swallowing poison. That is important, right? I do want to mask up in a pandemic. I don't want to get infected by things. That is important. That is good. And so that we can avoid it kicking in and being in control when it shouldn't be, when it's not appropriate, when I would cause harm, when it would fracture the body of Christ. Notice, I always love to point to where Paul is talking about the body of Christ, and he says, he's was it 1 Corinthians 12, and he's talking about, you have these different this body, and it's got many parts, and how terrible would it be if one part were disgusted by the other part? And I would argue that disgust is explicitly being condemned, like disgust in the church towards other members of the body of Christ are being explicitly condemned by Paul in that passage. Yeah. Right. And he's calling out he uses both the parts of the body that are, he even talks about the parts of the body that are, he says, without honor, we clothe with greater honor. Right. He says, we should perform before the world, honoring as the church of those members of our corporate body that the world sees as less honorable, that the world sees as stigmatized or socially disgusting. But then we just get to the practices, right? Like this is where this is the good stuff. We are to eat together. Paul and I both grew up in an Anabaptist tradition. I'm still a member of a Mennonite church. My wife is a Mennonite pastor. And with the various terms that evangelicals and Mennonites and Anabaptists and people talk about, but table fellowship, sitting and eating together, sharing the love feast. In an Anabaptist tradition, we have the threefold communion service, right? So there's a love feast where we just eat together. We eat the food together. Then there is also the Eucharist, and we can get into the Eucharist. And oh my gosh, I as a scholar of disgust and theologian, I am so excited about the Eucharist. And there's a foot washing, right? So there are all of these parts that actually have the potential to both excite our disgust reaction and to help us acquire a better relationship to our disgust. Because to look at those things Paul was talking about just a second ago, right? I'm going to start with the foot washing because it's fun and it's the one that people, other Christians tend to find the most odd.
Before you talk about it, it's interesting, because you reference 1 Corinthians 12 and like the body, but 1 Corinthians 11 is the major treatise on the Eucharist, right? So like they're intimately tied together, right? And yet evangelicalism has separated. We want Eucharist to be, or the communion just to be me and Jesus moment. We're not going to talk about gifts of the body and our effect on one another and disgust and how it actually operates at the Eucharistic table. So like I think we need to pay more attention to where 1 Corinthians 12 lands after the Eucharist
absolutely.
versus anyway. Again, we're
Well,
going
and
to
then
get
they're
on my high
followed by
horse.
1 Corinthians. No, like
Yeah.
you're spot on, because then they're followed by 1 Corinthians 13, and it is
13.
love that empowers all of that, makes all of that possible, right? It is intimacy that makes all of this possible. Like Paul knew what he was talking about,
Right.
like Saint Paul, my brother too, but
Not nearly as much.
Yeah.
So I was going to say, talk about about foot washing. Foot washing is gross. Foot washing is fundamentally gross. It is also distressingly intimate, right? In the church that Paul and I grew up in, it was always a sex segregated activity, and I'll let that just sit. But there is this sense of intimacy, right? There's a touching, and there's touching of a part of a person that is some people sexualize it, but most people don't. But it's still kind of like you don't want other people to be exposed to that part of you because it smells bad. It's your feet, but it's, that's all very complicated. And what it invites us to do when it's being done in the context of this is a religious obligation, this is a religious duty, this is a religious spiritual practice, is to slow down, to notice our reaction, and to remember our relationship with the person whose feet we are washing or who is washing our feet. Slow down, mindfulness, intimacy. Slow down, mindfulness, intimacy. Yeah.
And say it, like I think for a lot of people, it's one thing to be like, okay, I could wash somebody else's feet, but then to have somebody else wash your feet, right? Is this whole other side of like, oh, but I'm going to let Andrew see that part of me. I'm going to let Andrew interact with my gross thing. I'm supposed to be put together. I'll be the helpful. I'm happy to be the one to help you. I'm much less comfortable allowing you into my mess, into letting you have a disgust reaction about some part of me.
What even goes back to
go ahead.
It goes back to the Good Samaritan parable, because the disgusting aspect of that is that the Jew is helped by the Samaritan. Like, it's the Jew can help a Samaritan, but can the Jew be helped by a Samaritan? And so, like, I think it's both ways. Like, even if you're not in a foot washing ceremony, I think like to think through of like, okay, who are we going to let help us and aid us, and be in the recipient.
And think about what this does as part of a threefold communion service. Is it means that as we come into the space, we come into this space with our own potential contaminatingness at the forefront of our minds, right? Like we come in with a hyper awareness of the ways in which we are gross and in which our grossness has been alleviated by somebody else, right? So already intimacy is being fostered, it is being created, that vulnerability. And also we are both aware of disgust as a thing, and also we're a little bit like less likely to be lashing out if we're in that both intimate space and we're aware that we are a potential contaminant, right? Now, there are other ways, and this is probably a whole other conversation at some point, in which when I feel particularly vulnerable to being perceived as a contaminant, I'm going to be hyper exclusionary of other people. I might get really violent, actually. So just be careful about a lot of this. But when it's done in the context of intimacy, when it's done in the context of like, this is a religious observance that we do together, it can have these really, really positive effects. And then we come in and we sit and we eat together. We have the love feast. And I don't think it's an accident that we call it a love feast, right? This is meant to be in some ways everything that is good about a meal, right? Like a good meal is a shared meal. I will argue till the day that I die that the best meals are shared meals. We want to be, I love the kinds of meals I was invited, a friend of mine invited me to eat Indian and Nepalese food with them recently. And they did that wonderful thing where we ordered 3 or 4 entrees, and then we just, we're passing things around and saying, oh, you've got to try this, and like ladling something from this dish onto your rice and putting a little bit of your naan in that sauce. And right, because, in that context, one, there is some disgusting, potentially, things happening at the biological level, right? Like, no, we don't want to double dip because we're good, but it's so close, right? It's hard to be sure that nobody else is, but that's not how you're thinking, because you're with friends and you're laughing and you're tasting good food and you are all becoming the same thing, right? This is in a shared meal. All of you are having the same set of substances become you. You are all being transformed by the same things. And I would argue that at a spiritual level, in the love feast, we are all being transformed by the presence of Christ, by the presence of one another, by love and intimacy for one another in the context of the Holy Spirit and of Christ. So this is, I think, critical. And if I could, again, this is, I know that there are Anabaptists out there who get really excited about, believers' baptism. But for me, if I could fix one practice in the church, it would be everybody should do threefold communion at least once a month. Even our church doesn't, but everybody should do threefold communion at least once a month. And then we move into the Eucharist, which is, it's sort of the ultimate in terms of exciting our potential disgust reaction. Here is my body broken for you. Do this in remembrance of me. And how many of us as Christians who have heard that litany, hundreds of times in our lives and eaten that bread hundreds of times in our lives have done it avoiding the thought, this is a violation of the cannibalism taboo. This is really gross.
Yeah.
I don't think Jesus wanted us to avoid the implication of the metaphor or of the miracle that he chose when he gave us the ordinance, of the Eucharist, when he gave us that practice. Here, this is my blood poured out for you. That the central Christian practice involves a violation of the cannibalism taboo is deeply disgusting. And it should be disgusting. We should let it unsettle us. And at the same time, we should experience the other side of that. Like, what does it mean that we are being invited to be transformed by the essence of Christ? Whether you are a transubstantiation person or a real presence person, or even just a it's a metaphor person. Right. I'm not. I'm a real presence type girl. But even if you are in any case, the invitation to understand yourself to be being transformed by the very essence of Christ in this act, in the memory and the commemoration of this act, means I am being changed by that which is without and that which is now becoming within. This is going to, if we sit with it, this will turn us into people who are less controlled by disgust.
Such
regular
a great
practice.
Yeah. It's a great word, and it's a ritual like that. I think Richard Beck at the end of his book Unclean talks about it as a regulating ritual. When we feel inhospitable, or when we feel the world telling us to silo or echo chamber, the Eucharist should pull us back toward, it should unsettle us in this cannibalistic way, but also pull us back to each other, and because I think the disruptive aspect of the Eucharist is who Jesus serves at the Eucharist too. Like, he serves those that are going to betray him. He offers Judas the bread and the cup. Like, and he washes Judas's feet. Like, I think that unsettling aspect too needs to be forefront as we think about Jesus in me and I in Jesus. Like, I need to have my eyes up around the room and looking, okay, it is not just Jesus in me, but Paul is in me, Billie is in me. I am part of Billie, and Paul, I am part of Paul, because we are brothers and sisters in Christ. And so, like, this Eucharistic metaphor is disgusting because we all become part of one another in ways that we may not have wanted, but here we are, and we have to wrestle with our identity and who we are.
And a loss of control, right? As there's this like giving and taking and receiving. And I mean, that some, like, just to go back to the point, we don't infect God by taking Jesus in. God infects us, right? And it's that tiny little bit, it's little that infects the rest of us. And I think that is what's beautiful.
For sure, because like you guys write about, the incarnation is disgusting because the high should never come down to the low, like, but yet we are given that opportunity, and Jesus enters into the throne-ness of the world. Like, there's so much to unpack. And I think we could keep going for hours upon hours, but I also, have a family who needs, to get fed, or all of a sudden my kids turn into monsters, and we can go into all of those ideas too of what, but some ideas, like, it's a question I ask all of my guests as we begin to wrap up. Like, what's the story you want the church to tell?
Good question. You want to go first this time, Billy? Oh, that's you pointing at me. What's the story I want the church to tell? I think I want the church to tell a much more robust story of what love is. There's a Todd McGowan. He's a Lacanian philosopher and thinker who's had a big impact on me. And he writes that love is the way that otherness disturbs identity, which there's a lot in there. We don't need to unpack a lot of it. But I think we so often, the church has just reduced love to sort of hallmark happiness and comfort, and love is deeply disturbing. There, need to impact them. Like you are changed by the people you love. And I think if the church is to love the world, the church is going to be changed by the world. If we're going to love, and it has to move from the world, which is this abstract concept, to who plays music, to that annoying person at work who voted the different way. It's to people in our lives. And so I think if there's one thing I'd love, it's for the church to wrestle with how robust and how beautiful and disturbing love really is.
I love that. I think if I was gonna, I think I would say that I want the church to understand, to think of itself as more than it realizes it is, right? Like this story that you are more than you yet realize you are, and that joy, flourishing, is to be found in accepting, embracing, and growing into that. Right. So that when you find some new part of yourself, whether that is yourself collectively, our corporate self, or yourself personally, who you are, that is an invitation to growth and joy and delight, rather than an alarm. It's something to be upset by.
I love that you brought joy into it, because your aspect on joy that you write about was beautiful and profound, and I want more to understand about that, but that's a different conversation. It's just been a word that was on my mind as we started this new year, and then when I read it, I was like, okay, wait, okay, all right, I need to set aside, come back to joy, because I think there's a lot to unpack, especially with what you guys wrote.
Thank you.
Some fun questions as we wrap up about food. Speaking of disgust, what's one food you refuse to eat?
I sadly probably have way too many that I could answer, but the one I'll go to is I have a hard time with baked fruit. I know that puts me on a very weird, cuts out way too many things, but I generally have a hard time with fruit flavored baked items.
Right. Gotcha. So no pies or
chocolate pies are wonderful.
Okay.
Cinnamon pies, I'm all over it.
It's sad.
Yeah.
Chocolate pies, cinnamon pies are great.
Pray for me.
Yeah.
And he comes from a family that has a robust tradition of boysenberry pies. I mean, some of the best fruit pies in my life come from Paul's, from our family, and he's missing out on something beautiful there. But that's, it's on him. For me, it's cooked eggplant. I love actually love the flavor of eggplant, but the texture of it, I can't get my head around. I had, what does they say? I had a bad experience as a child, and I've never been able to quite get past some cafeteria eggplant that just did a number on me. And to this day, I can't eat. I'll take like a baba ganoush or something that is where it's been pureed, but if it's just cooked, I can't do it.
Which is sad, because we grew up in Turkey that has amazing eggplants.
That's true.
Right. Or like Chinese stir-fried eggplant. Like, it's beautiful and delightful.
Good stuff.
Smokiness, it's a wonderful flavor.
Yeah. It's just fascinating, as we've been discussed, like how much bad experience carry over and stay with us. But again, for the sake of time, what's one of the best things you've ever eaten?
I did
This
just
is
talk
hard.
about that boysenberry pie.
Yeah.
My grandmother's boysenberry pie, my dad's boysenberry pie. Dad carried on the tradition from my grandmother. My dad's boysenberry pie really is probably one of the best things that's ever happened in my mouth. We also did going back to my dad's cooking. He does a standing rib roast with Yorkshire pudding.
That's
He
what
did
I
for
was
Christmas
gonna
this
say.
year. I think that's a family favorite for a good reason. It is one of my favorite meals to ever happen. I rarely have felt as close to heaven as I have around the family dinner table with friends and family eating that particular meal.
I was throwing amen, and that was exactly what I was going to say. My dad's standing rib roast and Yorkshire pudding smothered in some gravy. Yeah, it's incredible.
And finally, there's a conversation among chefs about last meals, as in if you knew you only had one last meal to enjoy, what would be on your table? And so if Billie and Paul had one last meal, what's on their table?
So I spent several years in Kansas City. I do. I'm a huge fan of Kansas City barbecue. So there's some Kansas City burn ends, and there's some particular wings that would make it on there. That's the first thing that comes to mind. I mean, also the standing rib roast. I mean, it would be hard to not have that. But if I'm going to go somewhere different as well, it would be some Kansas City barbecue.
That one's hard for me. I know there's some sushi places I've eaten that have been just beyond joyful. I have developed over the last 10 years a real love for Afghan cuisine. The way that it combines the flavors of sort of East and South Asia with Mediterranean almost flavors just sends me. It's just sort of a miracle of flavor. And I'm a South Carolina girl, and because my brother talked about some kind of foreign thing that he had the gall to call barbecue, I'm going to talk about pulled pork, and it's going to be a vinegar sauce, and there's going to be hash, and there are going to be hush puppies, and there's going to be parboiled rice, and there's going to be sweet tea, and there's going to be beans, and it's going to be just some of the most joyous eating that is out there.
I think we could do
we're going to end with banana pudding. We will end with banana pudding.
Yes. I think we could do a whole episode on disgust and barbecue. I
think we might.
Well, Paul and Billie, it's always great to connect with you two. If people are interested in learning more about your work individually, corporately, like where can they find you?
Yeah, so we both have Substacks. Mine is just at Paul Hoard, and that's probably where I post whenever I publish an article. I also blog somewhat regularly. I'm typically writing on the intersection of psychoanalysis and virtue, or currently board games. I'm having a lot of fun on a series on play. But that I also post when I'm speaking in different places. Substacks.
I'm a little bit more social, so I'm on Blue Sky and Threads and Instagram, and I'm also on Substack where I do essays less regularly than Paul. He has the kind of discipline that I'm in awe of. But then I'll do tranches of long essays together. And I'm at Billie is writing, all one word, in all of those locations. So at Billie is writing, in all those places.
Yeah. And do pick up the book, You Contamination. I think it really does. There's way more in the book than we even began to scratch the surface. And so definitely worth a read in this year.
And it's spelled EU contamination.
Yes. Right.
Which was a mistake we made when we titled it. No, that is the correct title. We spelled it right and did not take into account that everybody would think it was spelled YOU contamination.
Yep. So
because we made up the word.
Right.
Yeah.
And if you've enjoyed this episode, please consider subscribing, leaving a review, or sharing it with others. Thanks for joining us on this episode of The Biggest Table, where we explore what it means to be transformed by God's love around the table and through food. Until next time, bye.